"Excuse me?" A voice purred beside me, rich and smooth. "Are you finished with the register?" I looked up from the page where my name, Sarah Miller, sat stark and lonely in the visitor's log. It was her, Elena Martinez. She was even more striking up close, her grief elegantly tailored, her dark eyes holding a composure I couldn't fathom. I felt a cold dread wash over me as I recognized the looping signature she'd left on the line above mine. The same last name I'd been seeing on Marcus's forged life insurance renewals for 12 years. I'd always assumed it was a fake identity he was using, another layer in his deception. It never occurred to me that the name belonged to a real person, let alone the woman standing before me. "I don't believe we've met," she continued, offering a sad, polite smile. "I'm Elena Martinez, Marcus's wife." The word struck me with the force of a physical blow. Marcus's wife. The air, thick with the cloying scent of lilies and her expensive perfume, seemed to solidify in my lungs. For 12 years, I had grieved the man I married, the soldier who supposedly died in Afghanistan. I had cashed the survivor benefits checks, maintained his life insurance, and built a quiet, solitary life around his memory. I was the widow, but the woman in front of me with her perfectly coiffed hair and her genuine-looking sorrow was claiming my title. The lie wasn't that Marcus was dead. I was standing at his funeral, after all. The lie was that he had died only once. My hand, still hovering over the register, began to tremble, but not from sorrow. It was the electrifying shock of realizing my entire life for the past decade was not just a tragedy, but a meticulously crafted fraud in which I was the primary victim. A sharp, metallic taste filled my mouth. I could feel the eyes of the funeral director on us, a silent observer to a drama he didn't understand. I had a choice. I could murmur a condolence, retreat into the shadows, and let this lie stand. Or I could light a match to the whole damn charade. Looking at her, at the serene confidence of a woman who believed she was the sole keeper of a man's memory, I felt a surge of cold fury. "That's impossible," I heard myself say, my voice tight and unfamiliar. Her brow furrowed in confusion, the polite mask faltering. "I beg your pardon?" I met her gaze, my own eyes burning. "It's impossible for you to be his wife," I stated, each word a chip of ice, "because I am." Her gasp was sharp, a sound that cut through the hushed whispers of the other mourners. Color drained from her face, leaving her flawless skin looking like porcelain. The funeral director took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised placatingly. "Ladies, please, this is hardly the time or the place." His gaze darted between us, two women claiming the same dead man. "Perhaps any discrepancies can be settled with Mr. Sterling. The reading of the will is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock." The announcement hung in the air, a ticking clock suddenly superimposed over the entire surreal scene. He was offering a way out, an off-ramp from the collision I had just initiated. But the timer had been set. In 22 hours, a lawyer would legally declare one of us a widow and the other a fraud, and I had no idea which one I would be. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The funeral director's words about the will reading echoed in the sudden tense silence between me and the woman who called herself Marcus's wife. I gave her one last look, a promise of chaos yet to come, then turned on my heel and walked away. I could feel every eye in the room on my back, the whispers starting to ripple through the crowd of mourners like a lit fuse. My mind was a whirlwind of shock and incandescent rage. On a table near the exit, where I had signed my name into this nightmare, lay the visitor log. It was the only piece of physical evidence that I was ever here, that my claim, however insane it sounded, had been made. On pure screaming impulse, I swiped the cheap clipboard off the table, tucked it under my arm like it belonged to me, and pushed through the heavy oak doors into the searing afternoon sun. The air outside was humid and still, stark contrast to the refrigerated lies inside. I fumbled for my car keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the lock. Once inside, I threw the clipboard onto the passenger seat and snatched my phone from my purse, my thumbs scrolling frantically through contacts until I found the one I hadn't needed in a decade. It rang twice before he picked up. "Rivera." His voice was older, gravelly, but steady as a rock. "Detective Rivera, it's Sarah Miller," I said, my own voice tight. "I need to report insurance fraud. It's about my husband, Marcus. There was a pause. Sarah, Marcus died 12 years ago. We closed that case. I squeezed my eyes shut. I know, the thing is, he died again yesterday. A sharp rap on my driver's side window made me jump, my phone nearly slipping from my grasp. It was Elena. Her face was a mask of fury, her elegant composure shattered. "What the hell was that?" she demanded through the glass, her voice muffled but her rage perfectly clear. "You can't just walk in there, drop a bomb like that, and walk away. Who are you?" I ignored her, keeping my eyes fixed on the cracked pavement of the parking lot, and pressed the speakerphone button. "Sarah, what are you talking about?" Rivera's voice filled the small space of my car, a lifeline of sanity in a world gone mad. "Where are you?" Elena rapped on the window again, harder this time. "Open this door. Tell me who you are." I took a deep, shuddering breath and looked at her. At this stranger whose life was tangled with mine in a web of deceit I was only beginning to understand. "I'm at the Paradise Gardens funeral home," I said into the phone, my voice loud enough for Elena to hear. "I'm at my husband's funeral." Elena recoiled from the window as if I'd slapped her, her mouth falling open. "That's not possible," she mouthed silently. "Okay, Sarah, stay calm. I'm running his name again," Rivera said. I could hear the clacking of a keyboard, the sounds of a life being exhumed digitally. "You're Marcus Miller, DOB August 14th, 1980, declared legally deceased October 27th, 2012. "Correct?" "Correct," I whispered, watching as Elena pulled out her own phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She was probably calling the police, or a lawyer, or someone to deal with the crazy woman in the parking lot. "This is strange," Rivera muttered. "I'm showing another Marcus. A Marcus Martinez. Same date of birth." My blood ran cold. Martinez. The name on the life insurance forms. The name she had signed in the book. "He has a different social security number," Rivera continued, his voice edged with disbelief. "But he has a marriage certificate issued 5 years ago to an Elena Martinez, and a death certificate filed yesterday." Elena looked up from her phone, her eyes locking with mine. The anger in them was slowly being replaced by a dawning, horrified confusion. "But Sarah," Rivera's voice crackled. "I'm also looking at your marriage certificate to Marcus Miller from 14 years ago. 1 man, 2 names, 2 wives, 2 deaths. The scope of his deception was vaster than I could have ever imagined." The funeral director came scurrying out of the building, his face flushed with panic. He bypassed me and went straight to Elena, who was still staring at me through the glass. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, his voice strained. He glanced nervously at my car, and I saw his eyes fall on the stolen visitor log on my passenger seat. He visibly decided to ignore it for the moment. "We have a problem. The viewing is scheduled to end in 6 hours, and you had wanted to proceed with the cremation this evening." He lowered his voice, but I could still hear him clearly. "Given the complication, perhaps we should postpone?" Elena tore her gaze away from me and looked at the director, then back at the funeral home, where the body of the man we both apparently married was lying. The cremation. Of course. In 6 hours, the last piece of central evidence, the one thing that could definitively prove who he was, would be turned to ash. The will reading was tomorrow, but the clock to preserve the truth was ticking down much, much faster than that. "The cremation happens in 6 hours," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Elena stared at me, her mind clearly struggling to process the impossible information Rivera had just delivered over the phone. Her initial fury was morphing into a volatile cocktail of fear and disbelief. "This is insane," she whispered, more to herself than to me. The funeral director hovered uselessly, a ship captain on a vessel that was already sinking. "I'm stopping it," I said, my voice finding a cold resolve I didn't know I possessed. "You can't," Elena snapped back, a flicker of her earlier fire returning. "The arrangements are made. He's my husband." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Is he? The police seem to think he was mine, too. He had 2 social security numbers, Elena. He had 2 marriage certificates. Don't you want to find out who you really married before you let the only definitive proof go up in smoke?" I saw the conflict warring in her eyes, the desire to believe her life was real versus the terrifying possibility that it wasn't. My car is right there, I said, nodding toward my rental. You can follow me or I can follow you. We can go to your house and you can tell me what a crazy liar I am. Or we can stand here until the clock runs out and never know the truth. Your choice. For a long moment, she just stared, her jaw tight. Then, with a curt, jerky nod, she turned and walked toward a sleek, black SUV. Follow me, she clipped out, and don't even think about trying anything. The drive was 20 minutes of suspended reality, a silent procession through a sun-drenched suburban landscape that felt like another planet. I kept Rivera on the line, speaking quietly into my headset. I'm following her home, Rivera. Can you get a legal injunction to stop that cremation right now? I heard him sigh. Sarah, that's a stretch. I don't have a judge in my pocket on a Saturday afternoon. Find one, I insisted. Cite conflicting documents, a contested identity, potential fraud. Buy me time. Please. He grumbled something about favors and overtime, but he agreed to try. I disconnected as we turned onto a street lined with manicured lawns and identical oversized houses. Elena pulled into the driveway of a pristine two-story brick home, and my stomach hollowed out. This was it. This was the life he built on the ashes of ours. Before I could even get out of the car, she was at my window again. Give me the clipboard, she demanded, her hand out. The visitor log, now. I handed it over without a fight. It had served its purpose. She snatched it from me and stormed toward her front door, leaving me to trail in her wake like a bad memory she couldn't shake. The inside of her home was a gallery of my stolen years. I froze in the entryway, my breath catching in my throat. Every surface was covered in photographs, a chronological map of a life I was meant to believe had ended in the sands of Afghanistan. My eyes scanned the wall, each photo a separate betrayal. There was Marcus, grinning, carving a Thanksgiving turkey, looking vibrant and healthy. There he was on a beach, his arm wrapped around Elena, her head resting on his shoulder. They looked happy. Genuinely, disgustingly happy. I saw pictures of him aging, the lines around his eyes deepening, a touch of gray appearing at his temples. Changes I had never imagined. There were Christmases, with Marcus wearing a ridiculous Santa hat while handing presents to two young children who called him Uncle Marcus. There were anniversaries. A photo of him and Elena dancing, their foreheads touching. The most gut-wrenching was a picture of him blowing out candles on a birthday cake, the number 40 written in blue frosting. He'd turned 42 years ago. I'd spent that day visiting his grave back in Chicago, a granite stone with a name and a date that were both lies. Elena threw the clipboard onto a polished mahogany table and spun to face me, her arms crossed. All right, you're in my house, now talk. What is this sick game? Are you trying to extort money from me? Just as I opened my mouth to respond, her phone buzzed loudly on the table. She glanced at the screen, her expression hardening. It's the funeral home. She answered it on speaker, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. Yes. The director's tinny voice filled the room. Mrs. Martinez, I am so sorry to bother you. I'm calling to inform you that we have received an official injunction from the county court. A legal challenge has been filed contesting the cremation. Elena's eyes, cold and sharp, snapped to mine. On what grounds? She asked, her voice dangerously low. The filing cites a conflicting marriage certificate and a prior legal status of the deceased, the director stammered. It was filed on behalf of a Miss Sarah Miller. We cannot proceed until this is resolved by a judge. I'm so sorry. Elena ended the call without another word. The silence was heavy, suffocating. That was you, she seethed. You had someone stop it. Marcus never ever mentioned to Sarah, you're a scammer. A parasite who crawled out of the woodwork to feed on my grief. A scammer! The accusation was so absurd it almost made me laugh. I was too tired, too broken for that. Instead, I reached into my purse, my fingers closing around the one thing I had carried with me for 12 years, a tangible piece of the man I thought I knew. I pulled out the small, velvet-lined box and opened it. Inside, resting on faded silk, was a bronze star and a purple heart-shaped medal. Then explain why I have his Purple Heart, I said, my voice shaking with a decade of suppressed pain. Awarded posthumously for his service in Afghanistan. I held it out for her to see. Elena stared at the medals, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt, a crack in her certainty. But then she looked up, her face a mask of cold pity. I don't know what trinkets you bought at a pawn shop, she said, her voice cutting. But you're not just a scammer, you're a delusional one. She took a step closer, her eyes boring into mine. My husband was never in Afghanistan. He never served a day in the military. Marcus was an insurance salesman. He worked in downtown Phoenix for the last 15 years. The afternoon sun streamed through the large bay windows behind her, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. It framed her in a halo of golden light, the queen in her castle, the victor in a war I never knew was being fought. An insurance salesman. In Phoenix. The words didn't compute. They were nonsense syllables, a foreign language I couldn't comprehend. My entire identity as a soldier's widow, the narrative that had defined my adult life, evaporated in that single sun-drenched moment. My small Chicago apartment, a carefully curated museum of a fallen hero, with his folded flag, his dress uniform, and his stoic military portraits, was a fiction. This house, this life with Elena, this was his reality. He hadn't just vanished mid-sentence. He had calmly closed one book and started writing another, and I was nothing more than a character he had left behind in the first chapter. The words hung in the air between us, a declaration of war between two worlds that should never have collided. He was an insurance salesman. My reality fractured. The image of my brave soldier, my hero husband, dissolving like a photograph left in the sun. I stared at the Purple Heart in my hand, the weight of it suddenly feeling fraudulent, a prop in a play I hadn't known I was cast in. The confidence in Elena's eyes was absolute. She wasn't lying. That was the most terrifying part. She believed every word she was saying. My shock must have been palpable, my confusion so complete that it momentarily disarmed her. The hard, accusatory line of her mouth softened into something resembling pity. You really didn't know, she breathed. A statement, not a question. I could only shake my head, a slow, numb movement. The strength that had propelled me here, the righteous anger, drained out of me, leaving an empty, echoing void. I have to go, I mumbled, turning before she could see the tears welling in my eyes. I stumbled out of her perfect house, into the oppressive Arizona heat, leaving the box with the medals sitting on her pristine entryway table. The front door clicked shut behind me, leaving me alone on the curb, a ghost in the wrong afterlife. I drove a few blocks in a daze before pulling over, my hands shaking too violently to grip the steering wheel. I called Rivera back, my voice a raw whisper. It's me. She said he sold insurance. In Phoenix. She said he was never in the military. I heard the sharp intake of his breath over the line. Jesus, Sarah. Hold on. The next 10 minutes were an eternity. I listened to the disembodied sounds of his office, keyboards clacking, distant sirens, the murmur of other cops, while my own world was silent, imploding. Okay, Rivera said, his voice grim. Okay, I've got something. It's a mess. He was playing a very, very long game. He explained it to me piece by piece, and with every word, the man I knew as Marcus Miller was erased and replaced by a monster of meticulous deceit. The Social Security number attached to Marcus Miller was real, but he'd managed to get it flagged as deceased with the Social Security Administration in 2012, triggering my widow's benefits. For 12 years, I had been collecting monthly payments from the government, money Marcus was likely tracking. He had been double-dipping in his own death. What about the life insurance? I asked, my voice hollow. The policy I kept paying on? That's the genius of the con, Rivera said, a note of grudging respect in his tone. That policy you paid into was real, but it was his secondary one. The original policy, a significant one taken out when he was younger, was structured through a trust. When Miller died, the trust paid out. The beneficiary wasn't you, Sarah. It was a holding company. From there, the money was wired to a new account opened by one Marcus Martinez. It was a financial sleight of hand so clean, so audacious, that I couldn't even grasp it at first. He had used his own death, my grief, as seed money. He funded the down payment on this suburban palace, the sleek SUV in the driveway, the entire infrastructure of his second chance, with the insurance payout that should have been mine. All the while, I was dutifully paying the premiums on another policy, like a good little widow, essentially watering a plant he intended to harvest later. My government benefits were his steady income stream, a morbid allowance paid for by the lie he'd built around me. My life hadn't just been a lie, it had been the financial engine for his new one. A cold, hard fury began to replace the shock. It started in my gut, a burning ember of rage that spread through my veins, clearing the fog from my mind. The money. It was never about the money before, but it was now. Every photograph in that house, every smiling vacation, every birthday celebration was paid for with my stolen legacy. The house itself, this monument to their happiness, was bought with my money. The will reading tomorrow at 2 p.m. suddenly snapped into sharp focus. It was no longer a hearing to determine who was the rightful widow. It was a battlefield. Rivera, I said, my voice dangerously calm. Yes. When we go to that reading tomorrow, can we prove this? Can we prove that her assets are my assets? It's a tangled web, but the money trail is there, he confirmed. It'll be a fight, but yes. We can prove financial fraud. We can prove every penny he used to start his life as Martinez came from the legal death of Miller. A slow, predatory smile spread across my face. Tomorrow, Elena's perfect world was going to come crashing down. Tomorrow, she would discover that the man she loved had not only been a ghost, but a thief. And she was the unwitting resident of a house built on criminal enterprise. Half of everything she thought she was inheriting was, in fact, stolen property. It was mine. I had to go back. I'd left the medals, my one piece of tangible proof from my old life, my one connection to the lie that had defined me. I drove back to the house, my newfound purpose a suit of armor. I wouldn't be a victim anymore. I was a claimant. I was a creditor. I walked up the driveway and found the front door slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped back into the silent foyer. Elena? I called out, my voice steady. No answer. The house was quiet. The box with the medals was still on the table. As I reached for it, I heard a faint sound from a hallway off the main living area. A muffled sob. Curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of pity I didn't want to acknowledge, pulled me forward. The door to what looked like a master bathroom was open a crack. I pushed it gently. Elena was sitting on the edge of the large marble bathtub, her back to me, her shoulders shaking. But it wasn't her crying that made the air leave my lungs. It was what she was holding in her hand, what lay on the pristine white counter beside her purse. A pregnancy test. 2, in fact. Both digital screens glowed with the same unambiguous, life-altering word, pregnant. The box of medals slipped from my fingers and clattered to the tiled floor. The sound made Elena jump, and she spun around, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. She saw me, then followed my gaze to the tests on the counter. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, a protective, maternal gesture that shattered my rage into a million pieces. A baby. He had left behind a child. This wasn't just about 2 wives fighting over a dead man's assets anymore. This was about a mother and an unborn child. Every legal strategy, every righteous claim I had just formulated in my head dissolved into meaningless noise. I backed out of the room, my mind reeling, and fumbled for my phone again, my finger hitting Rivera's number on instinct. I spoke in a choked whisper he could barely hear. Rivera, she's pregnant. I didn't need to explain who. He was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of my defeat. Oh, Sarah, that changes everything. What does it mean? I asked, already knowing the answer. It means you're in trouble, he said. Illinois, Arizona, it doesn't matter. The courts look after the children. A pregnant widow, especially one who was legally married to him at the time of his second official death, has rights that will almost certainly supersede yours. Her claim to the estate, the house, the assets acquired during their life together, It just became nearly ironclad. Any claim you have for fraud just got pushed to the back of a very, very long line. She's not just his widow anymore, Sarah. She's the mother of his heir. The word pregnant echoed in the hollow space where my righteous anger had been. I drove away from Elena's house for the second time, but the fury was gone, replaced by a chilling, profound sense of defeat. She was carrying his child. In the cold, unfeeling calculus of the law, that unborn baby was an anchor, mooring all of Marcus's stolen assets to her while I was adrift. I explained it all to Rivera in a flat, lifeless voice from the sterile quiet of my hotel room. The baby, the house, the life that was supposed to have been mine. "It's over," I said, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "She wins. The law will protect her and the baby. I'm just the crazy lady who showed up at the funeral." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I expected him to agree, to offer his condolences for this final cruel twist of the knife. Instead, his voice came back hard as steel. "No, you don't quit, Sarah. Not now." "What's the point, Rivera?" I cried, the tears finally coming. "I can't get the money. I can't get the house. What's left?" "Her life is built on a lie," he said, his voice a low growl of indignation. "Her claim is strong, yes, but it's attached to the identity of Marcus Martinez. We can't get your money back easily, but we can burn the whole fraudulent foundation to the ground. We attack the identity. We prove in court that Marcus Martinez never legally existed. We prove the man she married was a ghost, using a fraudulent social security number and a false name. If we invalidate him, we invalidate her entire claim. She might be pregnant, but she can't be the widow of a man who wasn't real." A spark ignited in the darkness. He was right. It wasn't about reclaiming my assets anymore. It was about exposing the truth. It was a scorched earth strategy. If I couldn't have my life back, I could at least tear down the one he built over its grave. The rest of the day was a blur of frantic preparation. Rivera was a force of nature, calling in favors, pulling records. He got me an official, notarized copy of Marcus Miller's 2012 death certificate. He gathered 12 years of my bank statements showing the widow's benefits deposits. He compiled my own credit card statements, showing a decade of payments to the life insurance company. We had a mountain of paper, a testament to a life lived and a death legally recognized. My final touch was a simple manila folder. On the tab, I wrote in sharp black ink, "Elena Martinez, medical history." It was empty, a complete bluff. But I was done playing the victim. I walked into the probate courtroom the next day at 1:55 p.m. with Detective Rivera at my side. The room was small and suffocatingly quiet, all polished wood and the faint smell of old paper. Elena was already there, sitting beside a man in a crisp, expensive suit, her lawyer. She looked pale but composed, her hand resting almost imperceptibly on her stomach. Her lawyer radiated an aura of smug confidence. He saw me and Rivera, and a flicker of annoyance crossed his face, the expression of a man swatting away a fly. Then he saw the document box I carried. I walked to the petitioner's table and began to unload the contents with deliberate, audible thuds. First, the certified 2012 death certificate of Marcus Miller. Second, the thick stack of my insurance statements. Third, my bank records. Finally, I placed the empty, ominous-looking folder regarding Elena's medical history on the corner of the table, making sure the label was pointed directly at her. I watched as Elena's eyes tracked from one file to the next. When her gaze landed on the last one, all the color drained from her face. Her composure finally cracked, her eyes wide with fear and confusion, as she realized this wasn't just a story. I had receipts. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Hartwell with tired eyes, called the hearing to order. Elena's lawyer stood up, his voice smooth and condescending. "Your Honor, this should be a simple matter of executing the last will and testament of my client's deceased husband, Marcus Martinez." Judge Hartwell looked over her spectacles at me. "Miss Miller, you filed a motion to contest. On what grounds?" Rivera stood, addressing the court not as a cop, but as my advocate. "On the grounds that the deceased is not who he purports to be, Your Honor. My client, Sarah Miller, was legally widowed from this same man under the name Marcus Miller in 2012. We have the death certificate to prove it." Elena's lawyer scoffed. Your Honor, that's impossible. My client filed her husband's death certificate with this court yesterday. A death certificate for a man living under a fraudulent identity, Rivera countered, his voice booming in the small room. Under the law, a person can only die once. The first legal death takes precedence. We ask this court to recognize the 2012 death date and declare all legal and financial transactions made by the deceased under the alias Martinez's after that date to be null and void. The judge stared at the two death certificates on her desk. Elena, her face ashen, leaned toward her lawyer and whispered frantically, then looked at me, her eyes pleading. "Then who did I bury?" she asked, her voice cracking, loud enough for the whole court to hear. Her lawyer shot her a look, then turned back to the judge, his smooth demeanor gone, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his brow. He was cornered. He had to save his client from being implicated in a decade of federal fraud. He played the only card he had left. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaky, "my client was a victim in all of this. We have reason to believe that the identity change was not for criminal purposes. Marcus Miller became Marcus Martinez because he was a participant in the Federal Witness Protection Program." A collective gasp went through the small courtroom. WITSEC. The word landed like a bomb, rearranging every piece of the puzzle into a new, terrifying picture. He wasn't just a con man. He was a witness. He wasn't hiding from me. He was hiding from someone far more dangerous. He was hiding from certain cartel connections he made during his time in Phoenix, the lawyer continued, his voice dropping. We believe his death last week was not an accident. We believe someone finally found him. The judge's gavel, which had been raised to demand order, froze in midair. The entire context of the hearing had shifted from civil fraud to federal murder. As if on cue, the courtroom doors swung open. Two people, a man and a woman in dark, severe suits, entered with an air of authority that silenced everyone. They walked directly to the bench, and the man flashed a badge at Judge Hartwell. "Agent Collins, FBI," he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense authority. "Your Honor, this probate hearing is now a federal matter." He turned his cold, analytical gaze from the judge to me, then to Elena. "Sarah Miller? Elena Martinez?" We both nodded mutely. "You both need to come with us. We have some questions for you regarding the death of a federal witness." My heart plummeted into my stomach. In the space of 48 hours, I had gone from grieving widow to scorned wife to legal claimant. And now, as two FBI agents stood before me, I realized my new title. I was a suspect. The FBI conference room was an Arctic tundra of beige walls, scuffed linoleum, and the hum of unseen servers. The air conditioning was cranked so high I could see my own breath, a ghostly plume in the sterile air. Elena sat across the polished table from me, her face a pale, stoic mask. We hadn't spoken a word since being escorted from the courthouse into the back of a black government sedan. There was nothing left to say. We were two celestial bodies that had been orbiting the same dead star, and our collision was inevitable. Agent Collins entered, his partner a silent shadow behind him, and closed the door with a definitive click. He didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table like a priest about to deliver a final sermon, his expression unreadable. "Let's clear the air," he began, his voice devoid of warmth. He slid a photograph across the table. It was Marcus, younger, grinning on a fishing boat next to a man with a chilling, dead-eyed stare, a man Collins identified as a lieutenant in the Sonora cartel. Marcus Martinez, born Marcus Miller, was not just an insurance salesman, Collins said. Before he was given a new life by the federal government, he was the cartel's accountant, and a very good one. He laid out more photos, more documents, creating a mosaic of our collective ruin. There were spreadsheets with highlighted figures, showing cash from known cartel fronts being funneled into high-end real estate purchases. He slid these toward Elena. "You, Mrs. Martinez, were his unwitting money launderer. Your real estate business was the perfect washing machine to turn cartel drug money into clean, respectable assets." Elena stared at the documents, her hands flat on the table, as if to steady herself. She didn't flinch. Next, Collins turned to me. He produced copies of my bank statements, The monthly widow's benefit deposits from the U.S. government highlighted in sickening yellow. And you, Miss Miller, were his income stream. By faking his death and having you declared a widow, he committed federal insurance fraud. For 12 years, you've been illegally collecting government funds. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the frigid room. So, you see my problem. One of you is a money launderer for a drug cartel. The other defrauded the federal government. As far as the law is concerned, you are both criminals. I never knew about Sarah, Elena said, her voice steady, though I could see a muscle twitching in her jaw. I swear it. And I never knew Marcus was alive, I added, my voice barely a whisper. Collins let out a dry, cynical chuckle. Maybe, he conceded, his eyes darting between us, but you both knew about the money. Ellen and I exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. What money? We said in near unison. Collins leaned forward, placing his palms on the table. The friendly mask was gone. This was the interrogator. The $2 million, he said, his voice dropping. The $2 million he skimmed from the Sonora cartel's operating funds before he decided to flip. That was his price for testifying. The government gave him a new life, but he gave himself a retirement fund. That's the money he used to disappear. That's the money they're looking for. $2 million. The number was so vast, so astronomical it seemed unreal. It was the missing piece, the engine behind the entire decade of lies. It was the reason he'd vanished, the reason he'd built a new life, and, I suspected, the reason he was now dead. He hid that money, Collins continued, in an offshore account in St. Kitts. It was held by a shell corporation. He slid another document onto the table. It was a certificate of incorporation. He needed a way to clean it, to bring it into the country without raising red flags. That's where your business came in, Elena. Inflated property values, cash-heavy transactions with other shell companies he controlled. A few $100,000 here, a few $100,000 there. Over 5 years, he laundered almost half of it. Then, he turned to me and delivered the final, most vicious blow. He tapped the name of the shell corporation on the certificate. SM Holdings. My blood turned to ice. Sarah Miller Holdings, Collins clarified, twisting the knife. He hid $2 million of stolen cartel money in your name, Sarah. He laundered it through the business he built with his new wife, all while you were collecting his death benefits and dutifully paying the premiums on an insurance policy he never intended for you to find. He implicated you both at every turn. He made you his shield, his bank, and his alibi. The sheer diabolical brilliance of it was breathtaking. He had chained us together with his crimes, ensuring that if one of us ever discovered the truth, we'd pull the other one down too. Collins straightened up, his point made. He reached into his coat and produced a single pair of gleaming handcuffs, placing them on the center of the table with a metallic click. They sat between me and Elena, a symbol of the choice he was about to give us. Marcus is dead. We can't prosecute him, but the cartel is very much alive. His old associates are in Phoenix. We know they've been asking questions. They want their money. And since Marcus is no longer able to pay, they're going to come looking for his widows. He let that sink in. Here's the deal. One of you agrees to cooperate. You help us set a trap. You wear a wire, you meet with them, you tell them Marcus left you instructions on how to access the rest of the money. You help us get them on tape, help us recover the $2 million, and you testify against them. In return, that person gets full immunity for everything. You walk away clean. He gestured to the handcuffs. The other one? You'll be charged as a co-conspirator in a cartel money laundering operation. And for the insurance fraud. You'll be facing 15 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. One of you walks, the other one falls. You have 5 minutes to decide. My mind went blank. It was a Sophie's choice from hell. How could I possibly make a deal that would send this woman, this pregnant, betrayed woman, to prison for the rest of her life? But the alternative, spending decades behind bars for a crime I didn't even know was happening, was unthinkable. I looked at Elena, and for the first time, I saw not a rival, but a fellow victim. Her face was a canvas of devastation, her eyes reflecting the same terror I felt. Her hand moved first. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and pushed the handcuffs across the table until they rested in front of me. Then she pulled her hand back and looked at Collins. "She can't do it," Elena said, her voice clear and strong. "Sarah never knew he was alive. She never knew about any of this. It would be a lie for her to say she did." Collins raised an eyebrow. "And you did?" "I knew the man," Elena said. "I didn't know his secrets, but I can make them believe I did. I lived with him for 7 years. I can talk about his habits, his fears. I can be convincing. I'll testify. I'll tell them he told me everything before he died, that he trusted me to handle the payout." I stared at her dumbfounded. "Elena, no," I whispered. "Why? Why would you protect me?" She finally turned her gaze to me and her eyes were filled with a profound, weary sadness. "Because your husband destroyed my life," she said, emphasizing the word your. "He built our marriage on a foundation of lies and blood money. He left me pregnant, alone, and an accomplice to a cartel. He did the same thing to you just 12 years earlier. He tried to turn us against each other, even from the grave. I will not let that man win." Agent Collins nodded slowly, a deal having been struck. The wire they brought in felt cold and heavy, a metallic spider against the warmth of her skin as they attached it beneath her blouse. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Elena would call a number Marcus had circled in a notebook found in his home office and arrange a meeting at her real estate office that night. The FBI would be everywhere, listening, watching, waiting to swarm. But as Elena looked at me, her hand protectively on her stomach, we both knew the truth. The wire was no guarantee of safety. It was a leash, and we were the bait. It would either clear us both or get us both killed. Marcus's partners were coming for their money, and our shared nightmare was far from over. The inside of the FBI surveillance van was a claustrophobic nest of wires and screens, each one a different window into the trap we had set. I sat on a small stool, my hands clenched into fists, my eyes glued to the monitor showing a black and white feed of Elena's real estate office. Through the headset, I could hear everything. The gentle hum of her office computer, the rustle of her blouse against the hidden microphone, and the impossibly steady rhythm of her breathing. She was braver than I ever could have been. When the door chimed and 3 men walked in, my heart seized. Their voices were low and gravelly, laced with menace. Elena's voice, by contrast, was cool and professional. She was a masterful actor, playing the part of the grieving but pragmatic widow who just wanted to settle her husband's last debt. She spoke of accounts, access codes, and transfers, a script she and Agent Collins had rehearsed for hours. The 15 minutes she was in there with them felt like a lifetime. When one of the men made a sudden move toward her, my own scream was silenced by Collins' hand on my shoulder. "Wait for it," he commanded. Then came Elena's voice, clear and sharp, using the prearranged distress phrase. "I'm afraid those terms are non-negotiable." Collins spoke into his wrist. "Go." The doors on the van flew open, and I watched on the monitors as armed agents swarmed the office from 2 directions. The confrontation was swift, violent, and blessedly short. It was over. In the aftermath, the FBI was ruthlessly efficient. Elena's testimony, corroborated by the crystal-clear wire recording, was enough to ensure the 3 cartel enforcers would go to federal prison for a very long time. During a final debriefing, Agent Collins, looking weary but satisfied, slid a small silver object across the table. It was an encrypted hard drive. "We found this in a hidden compartment in his home office safe," Collins said. "We finally broke the encryption this morning. It seems Marcus was a meticulous record keeper. We thought you both deserved to see the whole truth." Later that night, in the quiet of Elena's living room, the 2 of us, the last surviving members of the Marcus Miller Martinez Club, plugged the drive into her laptop. It wasn't just financial records. It was a digital mausoleum of his deception. There were folders for each of his identities, complete with forged documents, backstories, and escape plans. And then we saw it. A folder labeled Predecessors. Inside were 2 subfolders. The first contained a scanned marriage license from Texas, dated 6 years before mine, to a woman named Catherine. It also contained her husband's death certificate, citing a tragic hiking accident. The second folder was for a woman named Jessica in Florida, married 2 years after Catherine, widowed 4 years before me by a supposed drowning. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to compute the scale of it. I wasn't his second wife, I was his third. My entire life story wasn't just a lie, it was the third draft. 6 months later, the Arizona sun felt different, warmer, less oppressive. The federal government, in a rare display of gratitude and perhaps guilt, had unfrozen the $2 million and released it to us, the only two women with a legal claim to any of Marcus's assets. We split it down the middle, no lawyers, just a handshake over the hood of my car before I finally left my old life in Chicago behind for good. Elena's daughter Sophia was born in the spring. She had Marcus's dark eyes, but Elena's spirit. And when she wrapped her tiny hand around my finger, she called me Aunt Sarah. Our shared trauma had forged an unbreakable, improbable bond. We started a nonprofit, the Phoenix Project, using a portion of the money to provide legal aid and trauma counseling to victims of identity fraud and long-form confidence schemes. We were taking the wreckage he'd left behind and building a lighthouse for others lost in the same storm. One Tuesday morning, while Sophia was napping, Elena and I were sharing a coffee on our patio, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The television was on, a national morning show murmuring in the background. Suddenly, a familiar-looking photo flashed on the screen. It was Marcus, or a man who could have been his twin, with a different haircut, a mustache, and a slight paunch. The chyron beneath the anchor's face read, "Grieving widow claims husband faked death in Nevada." A woman with tear-streaked cheeks was telling a reporter that her husband, a loving blackjack dealer named Paul, had tragically died in a car crash just last week, only for her to discover he'd emptied their accounts and vanished. My coffee cup froze halfway to my lips. I looked at Elena. Her eyes were wide, a slow smile spreading across her face. Not of humor, but of pure, unadulterated disbelief. She started to laugh, a low, bubbling sound that I quickly joined. It wasn't the happy sound of joy, but the broken, incredulous laughter of survivors. "You have got to be kidding me," she said, shaking her head as she gestured toward the screen. I took a sip of my coffee, the warmth chasing away the chill of the ghost on the television. "Apparently," I said, "we're forming a club.